best ways to kind of deal with an attorney-client when they're seeing these kind of emotional, cognitive, physiological responses.
Terrific. You know, that goes along with what do people need in the earliest phases of traumatic exposure. What they need is information and support. So they need strategies. They need tools. They need something in their a toolbox, so to speak. So what can you do to deal with, first of all, the feelings? Get people to start to share their feelings with others. And if they can't articulate their feelings with you, maybe encourage them to deal with those with a family member or a loved one. Perhaps journal their feelings. Put those feelings in writing if you can't talk about them with somebody. But try to get the client to start to expose themselves to those feelings early on.
And how do you deal with the balance between, you know, ensuring that a client can do those without the attorney becoming a therapist? Like, you want the attorney to create a good relationship that gives them the information that they need, but at the same time, the attorney wants to facilitate a good relationship, but also wants to ensure that this client doesn't get, I guess, doesn't go outside of what the role between the attorney and the client is. And do you have any suggestions to make to ensure that there's some sort of balance that's maintained there?
Well, I think it's incumbent upon an attorney to recognize when this is now outside the scope of my work as an attorney, when the feelings are continuing to color my ability to get the facts and to put together a case here. And in those situations, to make the appropriate referrals. And you know, those referrals can be to mental health providers, it could be to a spiritual leader, but to provide some early support.
Okay, so when you're dealing with a client that's saying, okay, an emotional response client, we don't like to categorize, but let's categorize for a second. So you're dealing with an emotional response client, you want to ensure that, you know, in addition to whatever referrals that you think they may need, it's, you know, you really should be talking to your family about this. This is a really important time. In addition to talking to me so we can get the information that I need, it seems to me that through your emotional responses that you also should be talking to other people as well. Then you have the cognitive responses. So what kind of response in that situation, what would the attorney how would the attorney address that?
Well, as we often say, our thoughts affect the way we feel. So helping people to see the connection between what they're thinking about and what they're focusing on can have a profound impact on how they ultimately cope.
Right.
One of the techniques, if you will, or strategies in the toolbox that I like to use with people is helping them to recognize what is the thought that you have that leads you into that path of really starting to spiral, almost like the mental snowball. If I took a snowball and tossed it to you and I said, break it, Segal, you just snap it. And that would be the end of it, assuming it wasn't ice. But if you roll that snowball around for a while, it gets bigger and bigger and uglier until you have a refrigerator-sized snowball. Our thoughts are the same way. So I very often will say to people, using that same kind of analogy, learn to recognize what that trigger is early on. When I start to think about that screeching sound of the airbag, I've got to catch myself and say, stop, this isn't productive. Catch yourself. Because it's very often not anything more than your own thoughts playing back in that repetitive recollection. And if you can get the person to break the pattern early on, it could be very helpful. Not a therapeutic tool so much as just a practical strategy of what you can do.
Interesting, interesting. And then as far as like behavioral responses, you can just some suggestions there.
Certainly what you choose to do. If you're not in a good place and you're hurting, change what you're doing. Go out for a walk, do something, take some kind of action, if you will, that is inconsistent or incompatible with that of sitting there and ruminating and playing that tape, if you will. Now it's flash, that recording over and over in your mind.
Right. And then I know we talked a little bit about spiritual responses, so I'll skip that one, but the physiological responses.
Exercise. Getting yourself moving physically. There's very real research that shows that people who exercise, those neurotransmitters, getting them flowing, it can be as effective as low doses of some of the psychotropic antidepressant medicines.
What if you're dealing with a client, though, that's actually unable to exercise due to whatever the harm is, the physical harm?
Great point. You know, obviously, not every one of these techniques or tools in the toolbox we can use with everybody, so it's a matter of being able to pull from them. I had actually written a book called Crisis Notes on crisisnotes.com, where I listed hundreds of specific things that people could actually do to walk them through being a victim to a survivor and ultimately a thriver.
Right. Interesting. And As far as we've learned how to address these responses, and we talked a little bit about the kinds of traumatic events that are impacting people's lives, but what are some traumatic events that you've come across that are, I guess, so, not to use the same word over and over, but so traumatic that in your experience, attorneys should take real note of, in addition to the normal everyday? What are some ones that you've noticed about that you would actually, you could suggest to attorneys that to be like, listen, once you see this kind of file come across your desk, this is something that you really should be paying attention to?
Great question. Well, as I had indicated before, first and foremost, to recognize that traumatic events and crises are really in the eye of the beholder. Mm-hmm. So how a person interprets and perceives what happens to them is actually more important than what actually happened to them.
Right.
Okay? Now, with that said, we also know that events that are particularly severe, as I indicated earlier, where there's a level of gore or gruesomeness or dismemberment, there's simply a greater likelihood that a person's going to have difficulty coping.
And as far as we were talking a little bit earlier about how in certain situations where you're approached for a family court matter or a custody matter, you'll actually take a step back and say, you know what, this is not, for me, I'm dealing more with these traumatic events and the responses to these events. As far as an attorney that's looking, they have a case, and how are they looking at the different types of experts that they can be approaching? What's a good systematic way that they could say, you know what, this is the type of case I have, this is the type of person I have to go to, or is it really a case-by-case basis? What kind of methodology can you suggest to attorneys so that they can go and find the right expert for them?
Over the 2+ decades that I've been in the mental health field, I've seen a change, I've seen a shift. Mm-hmm. And that is the shift from being really good at everything and being able to deal with everything that kind of walks into the office, right, to really having areas of specialty and specific focus. Mm-hmm. With that said, I think it's, and it really comes down to we can't be experts on everything. Right. But what we really can do is really focus very much and become passionate in a particular area. Mine happens to be this area, but I think it's incumbent upon attorneys to be able to identify people that really have an expertise in the scope that they're looking for, rather than just look, I need a psychologist, I need a shrink, or right, I need a psychiatrist to be involved here.
And this is important. I think that this program is very important in the sense that at least people now can understand what traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress and stress in general, how important that is and how very specific it is, and how there are specific psychologists that actually just deal with that, and being able to really identify what this person needs and what kind of professional is needed for whatever the case may be. So it's very important to be knowledgeable about what your client is going through in order to ensure that you're getting the right person.
Exactly. And also by virtue of your working with a specific professional that has a certain area of specialty expertise, that professional will draw upon specific tools that he or she has used. For instance, as a psychologist, there are certain measures, instruments, psychological tests that I would use in evaluating for post-traumatic stress disorder that would not necessarily be used in a custody matter. Right. And similarly, I'm not using the tools that an evaluator for the court in a custody matter would be using. So it's a matter of familiarity also with the objective instruments too. It's not just a matter of that person's opinion, but the person's ability to become aware of and knowledgeable through the objective data.
And what about different thought processes for psychology? I mean, I know that there are different types of psychologists, right? So you can have 2 traumatic stress consultants, and one has a very specific thought process, whether it be more behavioral rather than clinical. I mean, how does an attorney identify what's good for their case, and between these different theories of psychology?
Well, that's a very good point. Going back to the field of psychology, there are different schools of thought. Right. The old psychoanalytic or right, psychodynamic approaches versus some of the approaches that have more research support today of cognitive behavioral types of approaches. I think that attorneys should always rely upon data. Yeah. Being able to rely on research and having somebody on the stand that can back up what they're talking about by talking about the research basis. For instance, I had a case recently where I was testifying, and I mentioned that I had administered the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2, the MMPI 2. I was asked specifically to speak to the jury about what that instrument really meant. I had to talk about validity scales. I had to talk about the clinical scales. I had to talk about how the instrument was even developed. Again, this goes back to work with professionals that have specific areas of expertise and knowledge of those instruments specific to those areas.
And what school of thought generally, or what school of thought for psychology generally should, I mean, do you have a name for that type of school of thought that attorneys should be looking for?
It's not so much a school of thought as much as an area of specialty or interest among psychologists. Different graduate school programs will kind of train to different schools of thought, if you will. But being a licensed psychologist, for instance, we have to be familiar with different instruments, without a doubt. I think it's important, though, to focus on specific instruments specific to the case or the question that you're dealing with.
Interesting. And as far as when you're actually brought on to a case and you're actually asked to, let's say, in a consultant capacity, take a look at different documents, what kind of documents do you actually look at?
Well, there can be a plethora of records, really. It can go back to childhood, where I'm looking at school records from childhood, if they're still available. Sometimes they are, depending upon the age of the client. What kind of disciplinary records there were. Does this person have a whole history of acting out behaviors? Certainly beyond that, did the person ever have any kind of injuries? Was the person ever hospitalized? Certainly, was there any history of mental health issues? Did a person ever involve themselves in therapy or counseling or take medication for that? These, again, going back to that proximate cause, these are all questions that we really should know about before.
And these documents are compiled by the attorney and then given to you to look over afterwards.
Exactly. In either a consultative capacity, in a mental health document review capacity, or in an evaluative capacity, it's incumbent upon the psychologist, a forensic psychologist, to review all available data.
Interesting. Great. So, I mean, I think we're just about at the end of the program, but before we end it off, I just wanted to ask, I mean, if someone wanted to get in touch with you, talk to you more about your expertise, how would they be able to get in touch with you? What's the best way?
Again, my area of expertise and passion is in working with people who've been through challenging life experiences, traumatic events. Do we have to worry about labeling people with disorders before we get in touch with either me or a colleague? No. When we're seeing that a person's struggling, though, and we want to quantify or have a better objective sense of that, the impact of that for a case, reach out to us. I can be reached very easily, either marklerner.com or institutefortraumaticstress.org. Through both my own website and the organizational website, I can easily be found online.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated it. And thank you so much for joining us today. And have a great day.
Thank you.